Francisco Airport. We went through the Philippines to a particular tribe deep in the mountains of Occidental Mindoro. There are several tribes there. Altogether, they're kind of called the Mangyan. And these are kind of a nation within a nation. They have the right to legal governance. They are really kind of their own separate nation. They don't consider themselves Filipino. And for 400 years, different missionaries from different organizations, different denominations have been trying to reach these people, and there had been zero success. That is what AFM specializes in. That is the particular part of the Great Commission that God has called AFM to do. And so we went through the Philippines straight to the Mangyan people, and it's not on the screen right now, but as a kid, people often will say, so your parents were missionaries, right? And I actually don't like that very much, because we did this together. We did this as a family. We agreed as a family to go, and we each had our roles. One of my main roles, I learned as a kid, I learned the language much more quickly than my parents did, and at a deeper level. So I did a lot of translation, both stand-up translation when we have visitors, and all the Bible studies, all the different materials, the medical book my mom wrote, all of that I translated for them. So we did this really as a family. Now, that project was completed. I went back to college. I kept on going back every year. There's never been a year that we haven't been back with our people. And after college, I went back to the Mangyan people group again, the Mangyan tribes again, but to a different tribe farther south. And this was the most resistant of all the tribes on the island. In fact, in their ancient history, this tribe taught shamanism to all of the other tribes, taught them how to use the demon's powers. And while I was there, did you see in the last picture, see when I was riding the water buffalo, the guy standing next to me? That was my brother, not biologically, but I was kind of adopted into his family. I've called him my brother all my life. Well, when I moved back, he was my partner on my second project, and his little sister, the girl in red back there, his little sister came along with him, and we got to be better and better and better and better and better friends until we were more than friends. And she is now my wife. So that is my wife and my daughter. I married into the tribe. I've been working there, again, for 31 years. And I just got back to the States. I am so green. I have a hard time speaking English because I haven't really used it very much in the last 30 years. But AFM just called me back to work in training here at AFM. So that's just a brief overview. I'll be explaining a little bit of the results of our work there amongst those tribes at the end. But before that, I want to tell you a few stories. And these stories, though, will be illustrating what God called us to do. You may already know this, but if you don't know, in the Great Commission, there's actually only one command. There's only one imperative, speaking grammatically, and that is to make disciples. Most people around the world will say, go. So that's been our theme for the last 5 years, right? A little bit more than 5 years. I will go. But the command is actually to make disciples. We need to go to them to make disciples. Then we need to baptize. We don't need to worry too much about baptism, explaining that. We're pretty good at that as Adventists. But don't forget the last step in making disciples is not just teaching, though. It's teaching them to obey. We're not talking legalism here, but we're saying that Jesus is telling us that this is a process. It's not just teaching them the information. They check it off. Yes, I believe, I believe, I believe. The demons believe too, and that's not enough. But we need to help them to apply it in their lives, to learn how to be a Christian in their culture, in their particular way of connecting with God. So, how are we doing in this work? Now, the statistics I'm about to show you are from the General Conference, so I'm not saying anything that isn't public knowledge. Around the world today, there are actually this slide is a little bit old. Excuse me. There are about 3.4 billion people who are completely unreached. About 43% of the entire world population is still unreached. When we're talking unreached, we're not talking just individuals in the community that haven't been evangelized yet. We're talking entire tribes, entire people groups, oftentimes of millions, who have no access to the gospel. There are no local churches. There's no Bibles. There are no Bibles in their language. Radio, TV, literature typically don't reach these people, either because they don't have it at all, like with my people. They don't have access to electricity, to cell phones, to TV, any of these things, to internet. Thank you. or because they don't have contextualized materials. They don't have, like when we just translate amazing facts into their language, that usually doesn't connect with them where they are in their culture. Or there simply is so much prejudice against Christianity that they will not engage with those materials. These are the people that will not be reached unless someone personally goes to them. What about missionaries? Most of those who go as missionaries, in fact, 99% of those who go as missionaries, go to places where they already are Christian or they have access to Christianity. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything amongst these people. There is a need. What I'm saying is that the vast majority of those who need Christ are actually the least targeted, least engaged by our missionaries. Only 1 out of 100 actually go to the unreached. And the results, this comes right out of the GC retention study. The blue line there, that is the growth of the Adventist Church from our incorporation until recently. Where is the growth of the church? So the blue line is the growth of the world population. Where's the growth of the church on that chart? Yeah, you might have thought the green line at the bottom was just decoration. That's the growth of the church. Now, I have another slide. I didn't put it in here. If you zoom in, there is growth. We're not saying there isn't growth, but we're not growing fast enough to keep up with world population. And we know from Matthew 24:14, we know from the prophecies, we know from Mrs. White's description of end times that before Jesus comes, that the entire world will need to be reached in one generation. So it's been 2,000 years since God told us, since Jesus told us, make disciples of all nations. And we're actually, the net result is that we are, I didn't have that slide in there, the net result is that we're actually losing ground in reaching. Thank you for a confident yes. And the trainees know what I'm about to say in general. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples of 2 different views of how to finish this work. We ran the numbers, and by the way, this is the latest GC session, and on the second Sabbath, if I remember right, there were about 100,000 people in that stadium. Okay, so let's say that we take, in my grandfather's era, back when he was a pastor, evangelism would often take like 6 months, and then it got shortened and shortened and shortened and shortened, and oftentimes in the Philippines now it's down to like 2 or 3 days, just a weekend. So let's take this to the extreme and say that we do an entire evangelistic series in 1 day with 100,000 people. And we know that generally speaking, the best results from a set of meetings like this will be about 20%. So we have, check my math, 20,000 people? No, yes, 20,000 people, right? If it's 100,000, 20,000 would be baptized. Okay, the next day we do the same thing again, another 20,000 are baptized. The next day we do the same thing again, another 20,000 are baptized. It's like an evangelist's greatest dream, right? In 3 days, 60,000 people are baptized. But do you know how long it would take to reach the whole world using only this? Now, please, don't go home and say, John says and AFM teaches that mass evangelism is wrong. No, that's not what I'm saying. But using this as the primary, or in some places, the only method of evangelism, will this finish the work? How long would it take to reach the whole world using only this method? Over 1,000 years, if the growth of the world population flatlined. And we know, of course, it's continuing to grow. All right, so let's look at where Jesus actually spent most of his time. Now, did Jesus preach to crowds? Yes. Okay, so once again, I'm not saying that it's wrong to preach to crowds. Please don't misunderstand me. But if we look at the 30,000 hours that Jesus spent in his 3.5 years of ministry, the majority of that was spent one-on-one, discipling, training, mentoring individual people, a small group of people. In training, we say work with a few to reach the many. So let's just say on this side, on the discipleship side, that for 1 whole year, I am going to work with Lena. And not only am I going to lead Lena to Christ, but I am going to continue, even after she has accepted Christ, I'm going to continue training and mentoring and working with her until she is doing the same process that I did with her. She's doing that with someone else. So for 1 whole year, that is my whole focus. Okay? Next year, Lena and I each choose another person each. Okay, and we do that same process again. And the next year, we do the same thing again. At the end of 3 years, how many disciples are there? Not 6. Not 6. There are 8, okay, because this harnesses the power of multiplication. You get a geometric progression. 2, 4, 8, and on and on and on like that. On this side, it seems so slow. Here, in 3 days, we have 60,000 baptized. I'm choosing my words carefully here, 60,000 baptized. And on this side, after 3 years, we have 8 people who are disciples. How long does it take to reach the whole world on this side, on the discipleship side? 34 years. 34 years. 1 generation. And we know that typically disciple makers don't just disciple one person. Jesus discipled 12. For some reason, I don't know why, but most disciple makers, most people who focus on discipleship nowadays, typically disciple around 5 people at a time. I'm not sure why, that just shows up in the research, in the statistics. My friends, discipleship is the primary method that Christ used. In fact, the mass evangelism, the preaching to crowds, seems to be supplemental to his core strategy of disciple making. And that's what he told us to do in the Great Commission. That is the work that he left to the church to accomplish before he comes back again. So, how does this work? What does it look like? Now I'm going to tell you several mission stories. And the first comes from when we first arrived. Well, it was a little bit after we first arrived. Is this within the first 1 to 2 years of when we arrived to work with the Hmong Yin. Now, we didn't have a church building. We just had a little hut, well, a big hut that we lived in. And we would have church in the hut, either on the front porch or in the kind of living room type area, just kind of a central area like they do in their houses. And anybody who wanted, we would invite them to come in and worship with us. And Pistachio here was one of those who would come and would listen to the Bible stories. You can see my parents would always tell felt stories. And even the adults would be standing on things in the back to see over everyone's heads to see the felt stories. They loved that. It wasn't just for kids. And Pistachio and the others, they were hearing these stories. They were hearing about a God that seemed so much different. We didn't know at the time, but they actually knew the true God. But they had been told by their ancestors that God hated them, didn't want to have anything to do with them anymore. And so they were hearing these stories about God, but it was so much different than what they had heard. And so Pistachio, along with others, just stored these stories away in the back of their minds for future consideration. Now, when this particular story happened, this particular morning, Pistachio woke up, and his wife had already started breakfast. It was a breakfast of nami, which is a poisonous root, and they have to process it for about 36 hours to get the poison out of it. And then my wife doesn't appreciate it always when I say this, but she's not here this morning. So to me, it tastes kind of like rotten cardboard by the time it's processed. But they actually really enjoy it. And so their breakfast of nami was cooked, and as Pistachio was eating, their youngest child, she was crying, and so his wife was rocking her in the hammock, and as mothers do all around the world, when babies cry, she was singing to her daughter, except their singing is much, much different. They operate on a 3-note scale, not an 8-note scale. So it sounded a little bit like this. Si pari aliliau, nin mabuksilakoy dapulakoy katawan, agambulong katawagarutai. Except, of course, they're professionals, so they don't have to grab their throat for that. But anyway, as she was singing to her baby in the hammock, Pistachio noticed that whenever the hammock went this direction, the whole house went with it. And then when the hammock came back again, the house kind of stood up a little bit. And he said, oh man, those termites, they're so aggressive. It's only been 1 year and our house is already breaking down. And he said they don't call each other by their first names once they're married. So he said, old woman, that's a term of respect for them. He said, old woman, I need to go get posts to start rebuilding our house again. So after breakfast, he strapped on his machete and headed up into the mountains above our area. It's actually very beautiful. It's one of the places in the Philippines that has pine trees up there. They're beautiful. And he kept on going past that area, though, to something that looks like this. This is just, I found on the internet. We don't have a picture of the actual place. But how he described it, he said he had to go walk up this canyon, and it was solid, smooth stone on the bottom and the walls. There were no holes, no boulders, no gravel, just solid, smooth stone. And at the end, there's this waterfall, higher than the one in the picture. It was about 40 feet. And the trees he wanted were at the top. And so he started climbing up this waterfall. And he got about halfway up, and there's this stone ledge. And so he stopped to rest on this stone ledge. And as he's resting there, he's looking up at the trees at the top. And he's saying, yeah, that's a good one right there. That's nice and straight. No, that one's no good. It's crooked. I can't use that as a post. And what he didn't know is as he's looking up at those trees, there was something looking down at him. And what was looking down at him hadn't had breakfast that morning. This is a dopong viper, and we and several other people have done research. As far as we know, this is still undiscovered. Nobody, the herpetology books, no herpetologists know about this snake. If you are bit, if it's not a dry bite, you die in about 15 minutes. And this dopong viper, it's quite aggressive, actually. They say snakes aren't actually aggressive. This one is. It saw Pistachio there, and it launched itself off the waterfall right at Pistachio's face. And so Pistachio is looking up, and he sees this snake hurtling straight towards him, mouth open, fangs out, ready to bite him in the face. And in that instant, he knew that the spirits would never help him. Spirits never help people out of love. Demons don't like people, don't love people. They will sometimes do things for people if you pay the right price, if you pay the right bribe, but it's just in order to enslave you to those spirits. And he knew that a spirit would never help him in this situation. But, yeah, he didn't have a machete with it. Well, he had it, but he didn't have time to get it out, yeah. And in that instant, he remembered the God that the missionaries had been telling him about, and how God isn't arbitrary like the spirits, and how God actually loves them, not like the ancestors had told him. And I can't say that he had a lot of faith, but he decided to try. And so he cried out, just very, very typical for the Hmong culture, he cried out, God, it's up to you. And he threw up his hand like that, and he expected that he would be bit either on his arm or on his face. But nothing happened. So he slowly opened up his eyes and looked around, and there was no snake. And so he climbed down the waterfall, and he followed that riverbed about 50 meters down the river. And remember I said it was solid, smooth stone. There were no holes, there were no boulders, there was no place for a snake to hide, but there was no snake. He climbed up to the top of the waterfall and looked all around. There was no snake up there either. He believes, and I believe too, that an angel reached out and grabbed that snake. I have no idea where he took the snake, but reached out and grabbed that snake in answer to Pistachio's prayer. And I want to tell you, my friends, Pistachio started studying the Bible with us after that, seriously. Not just to see what strange and wonderful things the missionaries were teaching, but he wanted to know this God. And that is his baptism there. Just after we arrived, he was baptized. You can see my dad in the brown glasses in the back. And I and my mom are off all the way on the left side over there. And Pistachio is in the center. Pistachio actually was one of about 100 people who were baptized around this time. There were many other stories. I don't have time to tell you all the stories from that era. But many people ask me, why is it that we seem to see so many more miracles over there than here? And oftentimes people answer their own question, oh, they must have so much more faith. But I can't say that at this point any of them really had faith. And I can't say that we over here don't have faith either. What I have found to be consistent, though, is wherever the gospel is first entering, into unreached, unentered territories, where they have never had access to Christ, where they have never known about God, God to this day still works amazing miracles, and he still gives dreams and visions. Amen. The prophecy in Joel 2 is not just for the early Adventist church. It says in the end days, and God is still working. So the appeal starts here. If you also want to see God working in amazing ways like this, get involved in missions. Missions specifically in the frontier areas, in the areas where Christ is not known at all. Now, moving on, before I tell the next story, I want to ask you a question. And the answer, the cheat code is on the screen. Were we finished as missionaries at this point? No? Well, most evangelism that is done these days is typically just to the point of baptizing someone, and then we move on. We had gone beyond that point. We had not only worked with these people until they were baptized, we continued working with them until a church was planted here. And in fact, we hadn't just planted a church there, we had stayed on until leaders were trained from that church to run their own church. So our work still wasn't done? All right, I see some people with confidence, with boldness, still saying, no, our work was not done. And you're right. If you read this, Paul tells Timothy, this is a reminder to Timothy, one of his trainees, of how he taught Timothy to do missions. And he said, the things that you've heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men. We had done that. We had committed them to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. There's another generation. So you're right, our work was not done. And that is why actually I came back. Because our churches there were growing, they were planting more churches, but they were staying within their own little group, with their own tribe. And so after college, I came back with AFM again, but to the next tribe south to be a partner with the leaders that my parents had trained in going and teaching them to start mission work again in a new place, to mentor them to be missionaries in other tribes. And that's where we come across Abel. When I came, Abel actually already knew Christ. And so I kind of see everybody in two categories. Either you don't know Christ and I'll lead you to Christ, or you know Christ and I will offer to lead you to be a missionary, teach you how to be a missionary. And so I immediately started working with Abel and teaching him about the need to be a missionary. I was very restricted in where I could go. This wasn't technically a closed country, but it shared similarities with what we call a creative access country, where you're not able to freely travel or freely evangelize. I was restricted in where I could go, and so I started talking to Abel, and he came under conviction that he needed to be a missionary farther up in the mountains where nobody from the outside, nobody outside of his tribe was allowed to go. But he had several problems. First of all, his daughter had spinal tuberculosis, and she needed to be able to get to medical care. If they were to go farther in the mountains, if there was a hurricane or a typhoon, they wouldn't be able to get out to a hospital. Also, he wanted his kids to have a good education, and there are no schools up there in the mountains. He also had no way of supporting his family up there. All of the native leaders are tent makers. They don't receive a stipend from the outside so that the work will be sustainable from the very beginning. And so for about 6 months, he went back and forth, fighting with God a little bit about, should I really do this? Is this really responsible? And during that time, his house started to break down a lot like Pistachios. Now, they have lots of wood in this village, the village of Balangabong, but they don't have roofing grass like we do in my home village. And so when Abel made his mountain farm, every year they clear a new section of jungle for their farms. When he cleared his mountain farm, he left this one, sorry, that's again from the internet, I couldn't find just one. But in the real life, it was just one of these sago palm trees. He left one standing in his field. And that day, it was time to go get the leaves for making his roof. So he went to his field, and before he started there, he went off to the edge to where there's a stand of bamboo, and he found the longest piece of kawayan bamboo, specific kind of bamboo, and he cut it. He cut the limbs off, and if you've ever worked with bamboo, the limbs of bamboo, the branches, are kind of offset. So it actually makes a really nice ladder. So he cut the branches about that long and dragged it over to the palm tree, and he managed, it's pretty heavy, but he managed to get it standing upright and leaning against the tree, and he used some of the dead palm leaves that had fallen to tie the base of the bamboo to the tree, and then he put his machete in the sheath, and he started climbing up. And that's where Abel ran into his first problem. Because he got right to the very top, right to the edge, to the end of the bamboo, and it was too short. He was on the part where it's, kind of small and wobbly, and he was standing on his tiptoes, and he still couldn't reach the first branch. Well, they don't actually have branches. It's just the huge stem of the leaf. And so but he really, really wanted to get those leaves. And so he prayed, and then he jumped. Yes. And those leaves aren't always solid. Sometimes they're rotten. They also have big thorns. But he wanted them so bad. He jumped, and by God's grace, the leaf he grabbed, the stem was solid. He got his hands cut up a little bit, but he managed to climb up into the tree. So once he got up there, he got his machete out, and he started lopping off those leaves. And that's where Abel ran into his second problem. Because remember I said that he had tied the base of his ladder? Well, he hadn't brought anything to tie the top with. And as he's cutting off these leaves, one of them fell off on the side where his ladder was, caught on one of those branches, and dragged his ladder down to the ground, knocked his ladder down to the ground. Now, he had made his farm purposely out in the middle of nowhere where it would be hard for thieves to come and steal the things he was planting, the food he was planting. But now that was a problem because all day long he sat there in the top of this tree. He'd cut all the leaves off, and still nobody was coming by to help him. He saw a little bit of smoke way over there, and so he started shouting, "Help, help!" What he didn't know was an old grandpa clearing his field, and he couldn't hear anything. And so no matter how much he shouted, the old grandpa, he never heard. And so the sun started to go down that evening, and still nobody had come. There were no more leaves. There was nowhere. He's just sitting on the apical bud, for those of you who are in training, the top of this palm tree. He's just sitting there on the top of it. And he's thinking, there's no way I can stay awake. I'm so tired. There's no way I can stay awake all night. When I drift off, I'm going to fall out of this tree. It's better for me, while it's still light, to go ahead and jump. And now this is somewhere between 40 and 50 feet high. This is a tall palm tree. So Abel first took off his machete and threw it far away so he wouldn't, get poked by his machete. And then he said a quick prayer, and before he could lose his confidence, before he got too scared, he just jumped. And that's where Abel ran into his third problem. Because he was so scared, he didn't take the time to look where he jumped. And as he's falling through the air, he realizes that he had cut a stand of bamboo down right next to that palm tree, and he was falling through the air right towards these razor-sharp, I don't know how to say it in English, just the little pieces, the remnants that are sticking up out of the ground. These are so sharp, Alicia, in our place, they use these to cut the umbilical cord. That's how sharp these are, okay? And he's falling through the air right towards these. He doesn't have time to pray a long theological, flowery prayer. He just shouts, "Father!" and his feet hit the ground. And he expects, to be dead, but if not, then at least that there are, all these knives poking up through his feet. He expects for all the bones in his body to be broken, but he looks down, and there's nothing, and he feels nothing. So he gingerly, gets away from that bamboo and sits down and looks at the bottom of his feet. There wasn't a single scratch on his feet. I have friends who work in emergency medicine and have seen people who have fallen from a height, and they say if they fall straight with their feet first, it oftentimes will break all of the bones, just going straight up the body. There wasn't a single broken bone in Abel's body. And as he walked home that evening, he started thinking about all those reasons he had been giving God why he couldn't go as a missionary. And he said, "Okay, God, okay, you've shown me. I should trust you. You can take care of all of those problems that are holding me back." And so he and his family, they moved. They moved to an unreached village, the village of Pusog, and they planted a church there. And now they're training that church as their church goes and plants more churches in other unreached villages, even farther up in the mountains. And you know the reasons that had held him back? His daughter's spinal TB. Never once in the about 15 years now that they've been working as missionaries, never once in all those years has she had a medical emergency while there was a hurricane. They've always been able to get out when they needed to. You remember about the school? As soon as their kids got to school age, the government put a school in their village, and their kids have been able to go to school. The financial concerns that he had, I can't say that they've always had a whole lot, but they've always had enough to eat, which is God's promise that he will provide what we need. So friends, if you also have felt a call to get involved in missions and have something that's holding you back, Satan will try to stop it. Whether that's to go yourself, whether that's to go long-term, whether that's to go short-term, whether that's to financially support missions in whatever way, to do missions in your own community, in whatever way God is calling you to. If there's something that's holding you back, remember Abel, and move forward. What we have found is that as soon as someone makes a decision, Satan will put impossible barriers in their way. But when those people continue, just keep on walking, keep on going forward with what God is calling you to do, those impossible barriers will melt away. Keep on going. So, back to our 2 Timothy 2:2. We say in training 2T22. In our 2T22, remember that Oh, I forgot to put that slide in there. There's supposed to be that verse in there again right there. So at this point, we have the first generation of churches, Pandarukan, and that generation that we planted. And then we have second generation churches like what Abel planted. Was our job as a missionary finished at that point? No, it's still not done. You're right. Because actually in that verse, you can see 4 generations of a disciple making more disciples, and those disciples making more disciples, and onwards down. And what we have found just in research is if a missionary leaves after the first or second generation, over time, the church movement, the church planting movement will slowly die out. But if a missionary continues working with them until they're planting third and into the 4th generation of churches, it will never stop. It'll continue to grow and expand long after the missionary isn't there. And so our last story is about, we're going to skip the 3rd generation, go to the 4th generation church. This is the village of Hubkob. And we're going to skip over Manuel. There's a lot of good stories about Manuel, but he was the trainee of a trainee who was trained by me. And he had trained a man by the name of Aton to be the leader in this new church plant. Now, Aton didn't feel like he was qualified, but it was time for Manuel to move on. And so before he left, he put his hand on Aton's shoulder and said, Aton, I know that you don't feel like you're ready to be a leader, but remember, whatever problems you face, pray to God about them. Pray to God about them. And then Manuel left. Well, Aton stood as the leader the best he could, and God worked through him. God's Spirit led him, and God worked through him. And the church in the village of Hubkob was growing, was healthy. But one day, his wife, Aton's wife, went into labor. Actually, when Manuel had been there, she was pregnant. And these several months later, it was time for her to give birth. So she went into labor. Now, in their tradition, the husband will wait outside the hut. And there's a grandma or somebody else who will serve as a midwife. And so Aton, for 24 hours, Aton was walking back and forth outside of the hut. It was a very difficult labor, and they were really, really worried until finally, 24 hours later, Aton heard the midwife cry out in joy, "It's a boy!" And he was so happy, he started running up the ladder into the hut, because they always build their huts on stilts, ran up the ladder into the hut to see his newborn son when he heard his wife cry out just after the midwife, and she said, "He's dead, he's dead." And he ran up into the hut and saw his son there, blue, not even blue, darker than blue, like kind of a almost black color. And he ran up, and he told me that when he touched his son, he said his son was as cold as the rocks in the river. And he was so sad, and his wife too. They didn't know how to process the grief. They just both stumbled out of the hut, down the ladder, and sat in the dirt right outside their hut. And as the custom is with these tribes, every person in the village started to gather. The news went out. You know, the rattan vine telephone is faster than the electronic version, and almost instantly everyone in the village knew, and they started coming. And what they would do, as is their tradition, each of them would come into the hut and they would check the baby. And then they would come back out and they would sit with Aton and his wife. And every person in the village did this. So more than 100 people over the course of the whole night walked into the hut, checked the baby, came back out of them. All of them certified the baby was stillborn. Well, when the sun started to come up a little bit, kind of like here, the village elder came up to Aton and he said, Aton, put his hand on Aton's shoulder and he said, Aton, remember in our culture, in our custom, if someone dies during the night, before the sun comes up, they need to be buried. The sun is coming up. I know that you don't feel ready, but it's time. And when the elder told him that, when the village elder told him that, it kind of woke him up. He had been just kind of wallowing in his misery all night long. That kind of woke him up, and he remembered what Manuel had told him before he left. And he realized he had never prayed about this. And so right there, in front of the whole village of more than 100 people, out loud, he knelt in the dirt, and he started pouring out his heart to God. And at the end of his prayer, he asked God, please, God, please bring my baby back to life again. Out loud in front of the whole village. You know, they sometimes talk about those who are too innocent to know better, right? And so everybody's thinking he has lost his mind. He snapped. You know, the grief is too much for him. But Aton, he jumps up, and he runs up that ladder into the house, and he sees his baby, and nothing seems to have changed. He's still not breathing. He puts his hand on his chest. There's still no heartbeat. But when he does that, he feels his little baby, and his temperature is back to normal temperature again. And so he snatches up his baby, and he's walking back and forth, and he says, God brought my baby back to life again, but he's not breathing. What do I do? And he remembered, as in his distress, he remembered that the midwives will often kind of give him a little slap to get him going when they're first born. And so he gives his baby a good whack on the back, and his baby lets out this, I would say, blood-curdling cry. But to Aton, he said it was the most beautiful thing that he had ever heard. God had brought his baby back to life again. Not only in answer to his prayer, but as a witness to the entire village that God is, that God, he is real, that he loves his people, not like the demons, not like the spirits. And I want to tell you, my friends, today in the village of Hopkob, there is a thriving church. And the village of Hopkob is a fourth-generation church. We're not talking biological generations here. We're talking the churches that we planted second-generation churches. They planted third generation into the fourth. This is a fourth-generation church that is now planting fifth-generation churches. And this section of the work, of what we call a church planting movement, is nearing saturation, meaning, kind of like Paul said, there's nowhere else to go. Almost the entire tribe has been completely reached, and they're looking now for, where do we go now? Where is there a need now for missionaries? Oh, sorry, skipped a slide. So I promised you at the beginning to tell you what the results have been. It's been many years. It's been over 30 years that we've been working with these people. But the results, by God's grace, the 4 churches that my family and I planted, so the 4 first-generation churches, the leaders in those churches now have continued the work that we started. They have done the majority of the work till today. There are 47 churches. There are actually a few more, but I haven't done the documentation yet. So I know for sure of 47 churches with, actually we don't know how many baptized believers because they're all through the mountains and they're growing faster than we can keep track of. But we know of at least 2,700 baptized believers with, again, 5 generations of churches. And the movement continues to grow, continues to expand. And this is what we call, in modern missiology, we call a church planting movement. And this is what AFM does. Mrs. White doesn't use the term church planting movement, she uses the term movement. And she says that twice in history, there have been worldwide movements that have come very close to finishing the work. The first was the early Christian church, and the second was the Advent movement. And she tells us that one more time in Earth's history, there will be a global movement, and that the third time, God will not let that movement lag. And he will keep it going until every person, every single person in the world will be reached in one generation. So I want to challenge you to be a part of God's last great work. As I work all around the world, we see the problems in the world accelerating. I can see the work, God's kingdom accelerating as well. I have started to see these kinds of movements in Adventism popping up, springing up in different, in different places around the world that have been unreached and unreachable for decades, sometimes for centuries. I challenge you again to be a part of the last great work, the work of discipleship, the work of starting church planting movements in partnership with God. Last story, final story. I promise you, just a very short one. A friend of mine, someone I've known, worked in Irian Jaya for many years, about 10 years actually, when this story happened. And he knew the language and the culture very well. He was on an expedition deep into the mountains one day, and as the sun started to set, he came to this little village. And so he decided to stop there, and where I've worked most all of my life, if I go into the mountains and come to a place they don't know me, I won't see anybody. Like, you'll find a ghost village. You'll just see the weeds, waving as people disappear into the jungle. But in this place, they loved it. They loved having this guy come. They had never seen anybody from the outside before. They had never seen anybody. This guy has bright red hair, and they loved it. They crowded in. They put the missionary into the chief's hut, and the whole village crammed into that hut to see this guy. And so the missionary said, okay, well, let me take advantage of this opportunity. And he started telling kind of a what we might call a great controversy. Description of the great controversy. Basically, from the war in heaven, and then how sin entered the world, and on through, how sin affected the world, and how God had come down in Jesus Christ to save them from the spirits. For them, they didn't even recognize sin. So saying that God came to save them from their sin wouldn't mean anything to them. But those spirits, no, they're scared of the spirits. The spirits literally torture them. And so that was the point at which they could meet Christ, that Christ met a need that they felt. And he went on to tell how Christ was very soon coming back again to take all who believed in him to a place where there was no more death, no more pain, no more spirits, no more hunger, none of the problems that they live with. My friend said it was kind of the greatest success story he had ever seen. In one night, almost the entire village was converted. And so now he was in trouble with how to disciple these people because he wasn't actually ready to move to this village, didn't have anybody ready. But anyway, it was starting to get late, and so people started to drift back into their own huts. But this one wizened old grandpa, he still sat there. Now, he was pretty old when this brand new, very strange to them, news came. And so he was trying to wrap his mind around it. And as a shaman, they're usually very spiritually perceptive. So he felt in his heart that there's something good. There's power in what this guy is saying. And it's good power. It's not like the spirits. And so he wanted to understand, but it's so hard to understand these very strange concepts. So he sat there and he kept trying to listen. And as long as somebody was listening, the missionary, he kept on teaching, even if it was just one person. Until he noticed the grandpa. He started to shake, and great tears started to roll down his cheeks. And in this place, the people are very open about their emotions. And so he started crying, and he said, "Oh, what is wrong with me and with my people?" Kind of surprised the missionary, kind of shocked him a little bit. So he said, "Well, what do you mean, Grandpa? What do you mean?" And the old man, he said, "Well, how long have you known about this Jesus?" And the missionary said, Well, I've known about him all my life." "Well, what about your father? Did he know this Jesus too?" Yes, he knew Jesus also." "Well, what about his father? Your grandfather. Did he know this Jesus too?" And the missionary said, "Well, his theology was a little bit different, but yes, he knew Jesus too." And the old man, he started to cry again, and he said, "Oh, what is wrong with me and with my people? All my life, we have lived in terror of these spirits. Just a few years ago, my father, he died screaming in terror as these spirits literally tortured him to death." This is not superstition, friends. In places where people are under Satan's power, he does horrible things to them. And so the old man, he said, "Why didn't you come just a few years earlier? My father died. My father died without knowing this Jesus, without knowing there was any hope." He said, "Generation after generation after generation of your people have known this Jesus, and no one ever came. Generation after generation of my people have died, never even knowing that there is a Jesus, that they could die with hope. Why did no one come sooner?" He wasn't, English is failing me again, he wasn't angry at the missionary. He thought that there was something wrong with them, that they were too smelly maybe, or not clean enough, or whatever it was, something wrong with them, that nobody would come. He was thinking to himself, who would know this and not tell everyone who needed to know? So he thought there must be something wrong with them. But what could the missionary answer? He was actually kind of embarrassed, and he had a hard time answering the grandpa. Was it their fault that they didn't know Jesus? No, of course not, because they had no way to know. There was no way that they could know Jesus and know the blessed hope that we carry unless someone went to them. Someone took the time. It takes a long time to learn the language and the culture well enough to be able to communicate in a way that makes sense to them, not a way that makes sense to us, but in a way that makes sense to them. Would take the time, make the investment in order to bring Jesus to those who most need him and will never know unless we go. Remember, this is what we signed up for when we became Christians. Our baptism, that was the signature on the contract, that our life would be to make disciples of all nations. There are many different ways to do that. AFM has one particular niche that God has called us to. There are different organizations in different places in different ways, but every Christian is called and is commissioned. Our life work is to make disciples of all nations. May God bless.
Our closing song will be number 575, Let Your Heart Be Broken. Could you please stand with us?